That brooch belongs to my dead daughter. The words cracked through the dining room like a gunshot. Every fork stopped. Every glass trembled. Inside the elegant restaurant Silver Lantern, the city's richest families sat frozen beneath warm chandeliers and white linen tablecloths. Then all eyes turned toward one young waitress standing near table 12. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 24, wearing a blue server's uniform, holding a tray she could barely keep steady. Only minutes earlier she had been thinking about rent bills and whether her paycheck would stretch far enough this month. Now, Margaret Whitmore, a billionaire widow known across the city for her power and pride, stood inches from her face. Margaret's hand pointed straight at the small gold brooch pinned near Emily's collar. "You stole it," Margaret said, her voice cold and sharp. "That brooch was made for my daughter." Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Around her, wealthy guests whispered. A child dropped his fork. No one moved to help. Finally, Emily touched the brooch with shaking fingers. "Ma'am," she said softly, "this was my grandmother's. She gave it to me before she died." Margaret's eyes hardened. Thieves always have stories. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore, Margaret's son, stepped in from the entrance and stopped cold. He saw his mother's fury. He saw the terrified waitress. And he saw something else. Emily was not hiding. She was standing there, humiliated in front of everyone, but still telling the truth. For one long second, the Silver Lantern did not feel like a restaurant anymore. It felt like a courtroom. Only there was no judge. No jury. Just money, silence, and one young woman standing alone with her back against the world. Emily Carter could feel every stare pressing into her skin. The businessmen at the corner table stopped mid-conversation. Two women in silk dresses leaned closer to each other, whispering behind diamond-covered fingers. A man near the window slowly lifted his phone, not all the way, just enough to record without making it obvious. Emily saw it. Daniel saw it too. And Margaret Whitmore saw nothing except the brooch. That small gold pin at Emily's collar had suddenly become the center of the room. A tiny piece of jewelry no bigger than a silver dollar, holding more power than all the crystal chandeliers above them. Margaret took one slow step closer. "Do you have any idea what you're wearing?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now. That made it worse. When rich people scream, everyone can pretend they are emotional. But when Margaret lowered her voice, every word felt planned. Controlled, deadly. Emily swallowed. "I told you," she said. "My grandmother gave it to me." Margaret tilted her head slightly as if Emily had just said something childish. "Your grandmother." The way she repeated it made the whole room smaller. Not a question. An insult. Emily's face warmed with shame. She could hear the soft clink of ice in someone's glass. The nervous cough of a man pretending not to listen. The faint hum of the air conditioning above the ceiling. She wanted to disappear. But she did not move. A few feet away, Daniel Whitmore looked from his mother to Emily. He had grown up around rooms like this. Rooms where nobody raised their voice unless they knew they could afford the damage. Rooms where staff members smiled through insults because their rent depended on it. He knew what everyone was waiting for. They were waiting for Emily to apologize. To lower her eyes. To remove the brooch. To make Margaret comfortable again. But Emily did not. Her fingers stayed near her collar, trembling but firm. "That brooch is the only thing I have left from her," Emily said. "I don't know who your daughter was, and I'm sorry for your loss. But I did not steal anything." The words landed softly. Still they landed. A woman at table 6 looked down at her napkin. A waiter near the bar froze with a tray of sparkling water in his hand. Somewhere in the back, a kitchen door swung open and closed, but no one came out. Then Margaret laughed once. A small laugh. Empty. "You're sorry," she said. "You stand here wearing my family's property and you think sorrow is enough." Emily's mouth tightened. Daniel stepped forward. "Mother," he said, "stop." Margaret did not even look at him. "No, Daniel. I will not stop." She pointed again at the brooch. "Your sister wore that piece on her 21st birthday. I remember the dress. I remember the cake. I remember fastening it myself because her hands were shaking from excitement." For the first time, something broke through Margaret's coldness. Pain. Raw and old. Then it vanished. The steel returned. And 17 years later she continued, "I find it pinned to a waitress in a restaurant." The word waitress cut across the room. Not as a job. As a place? A level? A reminder? Emily's eyes stung, but she refused to cry. She had spent too many years carrying plates past tables where people did not look at her face. She knew the difference between being served and being seen. Tonight she was being seen. And it was unbearable. From the hallway near the kitchen, the owner of the Silver Lantern, Arthur Bennett, hurried in. His face had lost all color. He wore a dark suit, polished shoes, and the kind of smile people use when they are trying to stop a disaster without offending the person causing it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, I'm sure this is only a misunderstanding. Margaret turned her head. Slowly. Arthur's smile faded. There is no misunderstanding, she said. That young woman is wearing my daughter's brooch. Arthur glanced at Emily. Not with cruelty. With fear. And Emily understood it immediately. He was not asking what was true. He was calculating what was expensive. The Whitmore family had hosted dinners here for years, charity events, political lunches, private anniversaries. Their name carried weight, their money carried more. Emily was a waitress with a monthly bus pass and a landlord who did not care about explanations. Arthur took one careful breath. Emily, he said softly, perhaps it would be best if we stepped into my office and… No. The word came out before Emily could stop it. Small, clear, final. The entire restaurant seemed to inhale at once. Arthur blinked. Margaret's eyebrows lifted. Daniel stared at Emily, something unreadable moving across his face. Emily straightened her shoulders. Her knees were still shaking. Her hands were still cold. But her voice did not break. I won't be taken somewhere private like I did something wrong, she said. She accused me in front of everyone. So I'll answer in front of everyone. A heavy silence followed. The kind that makes people uncomfortable because truth has entered the room without permission. One of the guests lowered his phone. Another raised hers higher. Emily saw both. Margaret's jaw tightened. You should be careful, she said. Emily nodded slowly. I have been careful my whole life. That sentence changed the air. Even Margaret felt it. For a brief second, the billionaire widow looked at the young waitress not as furniture, not as help, not as a thief already judged, but as a person standing in pain. Then pride slammed the door shut. I'm calling the police, Margaret announced. A murmur rippled through the room. Emily's stomach dropped. Police? That word carried weight too. It could ruin a shift, a job, a life. It could follow her into every application, every interview, every room where people already expected the worst. Arthur stepped closer, panic flashing in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, please let's not escalate this. She is wearing stolen property. It isn't stolen, Emily said. Her voice was louder now. Not angry. Desperate. But steady. My grandmother kept it in a purple velvet box on top of her dresser. She gave it to me before she died. She put it in my hand and told me it had always been mine. Margaret froze. Just slightly. Daniel noticed. Emily noticed too. But the guest only saw the drama. The rich woman. The poor waitress. The gold brooch. The perfect scandal over dessert. The restaurant had become a stage and Emily had been dragged into the spotlight without warning. No one asked her if she was ready. No one asked if she was innocent. No one asked what it felt like to have a dead grandmother's last gift treated like stolen trash in front of strangers. Margaret lifted her phone. Emily looked at Daniel. Not pleading. Not begging. Just looking. As if asking one silent question. Do you see what is happening? Daniel did. And for the first time that night he looked ashamed of the room he belonged to. Mother, he said firmer, now give her a chance to explain. Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen. She has explained enough. Emily reached slowly for the brooch. Every eye followed her hand. She unfastened it with care like it was something alive, like it could feel the violence around it. Then she held it in her open palm, gold catching the chandelier, light green stone glowing like a buried secret. The restaurant leaned in. Even Margaret stopped breathing. Emily raised her chin. Then look at it, she said. Really look at it. Her hand trembled. But she did not pull it back. Emily's open palm stayed between them. The gold brooch rested there under the chandelier light, small and bright, almost too beautiful for the ugly silence around it. The green stone in the center caught every flicker from the candles on the tables. It looked calm. Emily did not. Her fingers shook so badly the brooch trembled against her skin. But she did not close her hand. She did not hide it. She let everyone see. Margaret Whitmore stared down at the brooch as if it had crawled out of a grave and come back wearing someone else's name. Daniel stood beside her watching his mother's face. Arthur Bennett stood halfway between the kitchen and the dining room, trapped in the worst position of all, too afraid to defend his waitress. Too afraid to offend the richest woman in the room. And all around them the guests waited. They were not eating anymore. They were watching. Emily could feel it. The air had changed. People were no longer pretending this was a misunderstanding. They were waiting for someone to break. Margaret reached for the brooch. Emily pulled her hand back half an inch. Not far. Just enough. Margaret's eyes snapped up. You offered it, Margaret said. I offered for you to look, Emily answered. Not to take it. A murmur passed through the dining room. Daniel's eyes moved to Emily again. There it was. That same strange steadiness. Fear, yes. Humiliation, yes. But underneath it, something stronger. Something no one in that room had expected from a young waitress in a blue uniform. Margaret's mouth tightened. "You are making this worse for yourself." Emily looked down at the brooch. For a second the restaurant faded. The chandeliers blurred. The rich guests disappeared. Margaret's voice became distant. And Emily was no longer standing inside Silver Lantern. She was back in a tiny bedroom with yellow curtains and a small fan turning slowly in the summer heat. Her grandmother Rose Carter lay in bed beneath a faded quilt, her hands thin but warm, her silver hair braided over one shoulder. The room smelled like lavender lotion, old wood, and the peppermint tea. Rose drank every night even when she was too weak to finish it. Emily remembered that day clearly. Too clearly. The rain tapping against the window. The medicine bottles lined up on the nightstand. The little purple velvet box resting beside Rose's pillow. Rose had called her over with 2 fingers. "Come here, baby." Emily had sat on the edge of the bed trying not to cry because Rose hated when people cried before it was time. Rose opened the box slowly. Inside was the brooch. Gold. Green stone. A tiny flower caught forever in metal. Emily had seen it before but only from a distance. Rose never wore it. She kept it wrapped in soft cloth like it belonged to a memory too heavy to touch. That day she placed it in Emily's hand. "This is yours now," Rose whispered. "Grandma, I can't take this." "Yes, you can." Emily shook her head. "It's too nice." Rose smiled but her eyes were wet. "It was always meant to come to you." Emily did not understand. She had asked where it came from. Rose had closed her eyes for a moment. Not because she was tired. Because the answer hurt. "Some things come from love," she said. "And some things come from loss. This one came from both." Then her grip tightened around Emily's fingers. "Promise me you won't let anyone make you ashamed of it." Emily had promised. 2 weeks later Rose was gone. And now standing in the middle of a restaurant full of strangers, Emily could feel that promise burning in her palm. She lifted her eyes back to Margaret. "My grandmother's name was Rose Carter," Emily said. "She raised me after my mother died. She worked hard her whole life. She never took anything that wasn't hers." Margaret's face did not soften. "People say many things about the dead." Emily flinched as if she had been slapped. Daniel turned sharply toward his mother. "Enough?" Margaret ignored him. Emily's breathing grew uneven. Her throat ached. She could handle being insulted. She could handle being looked down on. She had learned how to survive that a long time ago. But not Rose. Not the woman who packed her school lunches when there was barely enough food in the house. Not the woman who walked to the bus stop with aching knees because Emily was afraid of crossing the busy road alone. Not the woman who saved birthday candles in a drawer because she believed every year deserved light. Emily closed her fingers around the brooch. "This was the last gift she ever gave me," she said. Her voice dropped lower. The room leaned in. She couldn't even sit up by herself anymore. I had to help her drink water through a straw. But she still made me come close, and she put this in my hand like it was the most important thing she had left. A woman near the window lowered her eyes. One of the waiters wiped his hands nervously on his apron. Emily kept going. Not because she wanted to explain herself. Because Rose deserved to be spoken of with dignity. She told me it was mine. She told me it had always been mine. I didn't ask why. I was 22 and I was losing the only person who ever made me feel safe. I wasn't thinking about gold or stones or money. I was thinking about how her hands were getting colder. Silence. A deep silence now. Not curious. Not hungry for scandal. Human. Margaret looked away for the first time. Just for a second. But Emily saw it. Daniel saw it too. Emily stepped forward slightly. "I wear it every day because it makes me feel like she's still with me," she said. "When customers snap their fingers at me, when people talk over me like I'm not there, when I go home too tired to eat dinner, I touch this brooch and I remember her voice." Her hand rose to her collar by instinct. But the brooch was still in her palm. That empty place on her uniform made her feel exposed. Margaret's eyes returned to the jewelry. "That does not prove ownership." "No," Emily said. "But it proves I'm not what you called me." The sentence landed hard. Arthur looked down. Daniel's jaw clenched. Margaret stood perfectly still, but a muscle moved in her cheek. For the first time she was not controlling the room completely. Emily was. Not with money. Not with power. With memory. With truth. Margaret took a slow breath. "My daughter wore that brooch," she said, but her voice was different now. Less certain. More defensive. "I know what I saw." Emily nodded. "I believe you loved your daughter." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Do not speak about her." "I'm not disrespecting her," Emily said. "I'm saying maybe two things can be true. Maybe you recognize it. And maybe my grandmother gave it to me honestly." Margaret stared at her. The idea seemed to offend her more than the accusation, because it made room for doubt. And doubt was something Margaret Whitmore did not allow. Not in business. Not in society. Not in grief. Daniel stepped closer to the brooch. "Emily," he said quietly, "may I see the back of it?" Emily looked at him. There was no command in his voice. No accusation. Only a question. That mattered. Slowly she opened her hand again. Daniel did not touch it. He bent slightly, studying it from where he stood. Margaret watched him with sharp eyes. "Daniel?" He did not answer. Emily turned the brooch over with her thumb. The tiny clasp on the back caught the light. There were small scratches there from years of careful handling. Little marks made by age, not theft. Emily looked down. Her breath caught. "There," she whispered. Daniel leaned closer. Arthur took one step forward without meaning to. Margaret's face went pale. Emily pointed to the inside of the clasp. "My grandmother showed me this once," she said. "I forgot until now." Her voice shook. "Her initials are engraved there." Margaret went very still. Emily held the brooch higher. "R.C.," she said. "Rose Carter." No one moved. No one spoke. The restaurant that had judged her minutes ago now sat frozen, watching the first crack appear in Margaret Whitmore's certainty. Emily's hand was still trembling. But this time it was not from fear. It was from the terrible, powerful feeling of standing in front of people who had tried to shame her. And not backing down. Margaret Whitmore did not reach for the brooch right away. She stared at it. At the tiny engraving? At the letters R.C. cut into the back of a piece of jewelry she had spent 17 years believing was buried inside her grief. The room waited. Emily Carter held the brooch in her open hand, her fingers stiff, her shoulders squared, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had said her grandmother's name out loud. She had put the truth in the middle of the restaurant. Now, everyone was looking at Margaret. And Margaret hated that. She had walked into Silver Lantern as a woman people feared. A woman whose name opened doors before she touched the handle, a woman who never had to repeat herself. But now, in front of 30 silent strangers, a waitress had handed her something Margaret could not control. A question. Daniel looked at his mother carefully. "Mom," he said low enough that only the closest tables could hear. "Did Isabel's brooch have anything engraved inside?" Margaret's face changed. "Not much. Just a flicker near the eyes." But Daniel knew his mother too well. He had seen that look when lawyers brought documents she did not want to sign. When doctors used words she did not want to hear. When his father died and the priest told her grief did not obey money. It was the look of a woman cornered by reality. Margaret lifted her chin. "No," she said. "It did not." Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the brooch. Daniel did not look away. "You're sure?" Margaret turned toward him. "Of course I'm sure." But her voice came too fast. Too sharp. Too clean. Emily noticed it. So did Arthur Bennett, who stood with one hand pressed against the back of a chair as if the restaurant itself might tilt beneath him. Margaret pointed at the brooch again. "The engraving means nothing. Anyone could have added those initials later." Emily's eyes widened. "Later," she repeated. "Yes. My grandmother had this for years. And where did she get it?" The question cracked like a whip. Emily opened her mouth but no answer came. Because she did not know. That was the terrible truth. She knew Rose had loved her. She knew Rose had placed the brooch in her hand before she died. She knew Rose had never been a thief. But she did not know where it came from. And Margaret saw that tiny gap. She stepped into it. "You see," Margaret said, turning to the room now, using the guests the way she used every room she entered as witnesses to her power. "She cannot explain how her grandmother came to possess my daughter's brooch." Emily's face went pale. Daniel stepped closer. "That still doesn't make her a thief." Margaret's eyes flashed. "I never said her grandmother was innocent either." The words hit Emily before she could prepare for them. Her breath caught. A soft sound moved through the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A woman near the bar pressed her napkin to her mouth. Emily stood very still. Then she spoke. "Don't." One word. Quiet. Dangerous. Margaret ignored the warning. "Poor families pass down all kinds of stories," she said. "Sentimental little lies. A pretty box. A deathbed gift. A few tears. That does not erase the truth." Emily's eyes filled but she did not blink. "My grandmother raised me." Margaret's voice stayed cold. "And my daughter died." That silenced everything. Even Daniel froze. For the first time that night, Margaret's grief came into the room fully. Not polished, not dressed in diamonds. Not hidden behind wealth, it stood there ugly and bleeding. "My daughter Isabel was 21 years old," Margaret said. "She had just finished college. She was too young to know how cruel the world could be. I had that brooch made for her birthday. 18-karat gold. A Colombian emerald cut like a flower. She loved flowers. She said the green reminded her of spring after a hard winter. Margaret's voice trembled. Just once. Then she forced it still. She wore it on a white dress that night. I fastened it myself. She turned around in the mirror and smiled like nothing bad could ever happen to her. Daniel looked down. He remembered Isabel. Not as clearly as his mother did. He had been older, busy, always running toward business meetings and family expectations. But he remembered her laugh. Her perfume. The way she left books open face down all over the house. Margaret kept going. 2 months later she was gone. The restaurant seemed to shrink around that sentence. Emily lowered her hand slightly. Not in surrender. In sorrow. Margaret's eyes locked onto the brooch. The police returned her purse. Her watch. One broken earring. Her shoes. She swallowed hard. But not the brooch. Daniel's face tightened. He had heard this story in pieces before. Never like this. Never in public. Never with his mother's voice stripped bare. Margaret turned back to Emily. So, when I tell you that brooch belonged to my daughter, I am not guessing. I am not confused. I am not being dramatic. I know that piece because I bought it with love, fastened it with my own hands and searched for it after my child was buried. For a moment no one breathed. Emily looked at the brooch again. Suddenly it felt heavier. Not less hers. But heavier. Because now it carried someone else's pain too. She could still feel Rose's hand around hers. This is yours now. It was always meant to come to you. Emily's voice softened. I'm sorry about Isabel, she said. Margaret's mouth twisted. Do not use her name like you knew her. I don't, Emily said. But I know what it feels like to lose the person who made the world feel safe. Margaret blinked. Emily took one small step forward. My grandmother was that person for me. She didn't have your money. She didn't have diamonds or private doctors or a family name people whispered about. She had a little house, 2 good coats and a Bible with half the pages loose. Her voice started to shake. But she kept going. She made soup stretch for 3 days and pretended she wasn't hungry. She worked until her hands curled from pain, and when she was dying she didn't give me bank accounts or land or a house. She gave me this. Emily lifted the brooch again. The emerald caught the light. I don't know why she had it. I wish I did. I wish I had asked more questions when I still had time. But I know the woman who gave it to me. And I know she would rather go hungry than steal from someone. Margaret stared at her. For a second something human moved across her face. Then pride covered it again. You expect me to believe that? No, Emily said. I expect you to understand that your grief doesn't give you the right to destroy mine. The words hit harder than a shout. Arthur Bennett looked at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. Daniel exhaled slowly. Margaret's phone was still in her hand but she had forgotten to dial. A glass clinked somewhere in the back. No one turned. Margaret looked around and seemed to realize suddenly how public this had become. The eyes. The phones. The waiting faces. The restaurant was no longer under her command. The humiliation she had tried to place on Emily was starting to reflect back. She lowered her voice. You are very bold for someone in your position. Emily's reply came softly. No ma'am. I'm scared. That stopped Daniel cold. Emily looked straight at Margaret. I'm scared of losing my job. I'm scared someone recorded this and tomorrow strangers online will decide who I am before they know my name. I'm scared the police will come and listen to you before they listen to me. Her hand closed around the brooch. But I'm more scared of letting you call my grandmother a thief. Margaret said nothing. The silence stretched. Then Daniel reached out gently, not touching Emily, only offering his hand beneath hers. May I? He asked. Emily hesitated. Then she placed the brooch in his palm. Daniel turned it over carefully as if it might break under the weight of 2 dead women's stories. He studied the flower-shaped emerald. The old clasp. The engraving. Then he looked at his mother. Mom, he said, voice low and tense, there may be more to this. Margaret's eyes sharpened. There is nothing more. But Daniel did not stop. Isabel's brooch disappeared the year she died. Emily's grandmother had it for years. The initials are hers. That does not sound simple. Margaret's face hardened. Give it back to me. Emily stepped forward. No. The whole room froze again. Margaret turned slowly. Emily's voice was quiet but it did not bend. It was my grandmother's last gift. Until we know the truth, no one takes it from me. Daniel looked at Emily. Then at the brooch in his hand. Then at his mother. And in that moment the story changed. It was no longer only about an accusation. It was about Isabel. It was about Rose. It was about a dead daughter, a dead grandmother, and one small brooch that had somehow traveled between 2 families who were never supposed to meet. Margaret Whitmore had entered the restaurant looking for a thief. But now, staring at the young waitress who refused to disappear, she began to understand something far more frightening. The brooch had not come back to her by accident. Daniel Whitmore did not move for several seconds. He simply stood there with the brooch in his palm, staring down at it as if the tiny gold flower had started whispering secrets only he could hear. Around him the silver lantern remained frozen. No music. No silverware. No polite restaurant noise. Just the low hum of the chandeliers and the tight breathing of people who had come for dinner and suddenly found themselves trapped inside a family wound. Emily Carter stood in front of him, her chin raised, her eyes shining, her blue uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. She looked small beneath the high ceiling and expensive lights. But Daniel could not stop looking at her. Not because of the brooch. Because of her face. There was fear there. He saw it clearly. Anyone could. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Her shoulders were too stiff. Her breathing came in shallow pulls, like she was forcing herself not to fall apart in front of people who would enjoy watching it. But beneath the fear there was something else. Something painfully familiar. A refusal. A quiet, stubborn refusal to be erased. Daniel had seen that look before. Years ago. On Isabel. His sister had worn that same expression whenever Margaret tried to control her life. When Margaret wanted her to marry the right kind of man, attend the right charity events, smile in the right photographs, Isabel would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, not yelling, not crying, just looking at their mother with a calm that made the whole house tremble. Daniel remembered it now with such force that he almost stopped breathing. Emily had that look. Not the same face. Not the same life. But the same fire. Margaret noticed Daniel staring. "Daniel," she said sharply. "Give me the brooch." He looked up. His mother's hand was extended. Perfect manicure. Diamond bracelet. A hand that had signed checks large enough to buy buildings. A hand that had silenced rooms for decades. But for the first time that night Daniel did not obey it. "Not yet," he said. The words landed softly. Still, everyone heard them. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Daniel closed his fingers around the brooch, not to claim it but to protect it from both sides until the truth could breathe. "I said not yet." A murmur moved through the restaurant. Arthur Bennett looked like he might faint. Emily turned toward Daniel, stunned. Until that moment she had expected nothing from him. Men like Daniel Whitmore usually appeared only when damage needed to be cleaned up. They spoke in smooth voices, offered polished apologies, and made sure the powerful remained powerful. But Daniel's face was different now. There was no polished smile. No public charm. Only tension. And shame. He looked at Emily carefully. "Miss Carter," he said, "you said your grandmother gave this to you 2 years ago." Emily nodded. "Yes. And she told you it had always been yours." Emily's throat tightened at the memory. She did. Did she ever mention the Whitmore family? No. Did she ever mention my sister Isabel? Emily shook her head. No, never. Margaret scoffed. Of course she didn't. Daniel turned to her. "Mother." One word. A warning. Margaret froze, not because she was afraid of him but because she was not used to hearing that tone from her son. Daniel had spent most of his life smoothing over her storms. Explaining her cruelty as grief, translating her arrogance into concern. Standing beside her at funerals, fundraisers, business dinners and family holidays, silently absorbing the damage she left behind. But something in him had shifted. Maybe it was Emily's trembling hand. Maybe it was the engraving. Maybe it was Isabel's ghost standing suddenly between them. Or maybe he was simply tired. Tired of watching his mother turn pain into a weapon. He looked back at Emily. "You said your grandmother's name was Rose Carter." "Yes." "Did she have another name, a maiden name, anything?" Emily blinked. The question caught her off guard. "I don't know much." She didn't talk about her past. Margaret gave a cold laugh. "How convenient." Emily's face tightened, but before she could answer, Daniel stepped in. "No more of that." The room went silent again. Margaret's lips parted slightly. Daniel's voice stayed calm, but there was iron underneath it. "You accused her in front of everyone. You called her a thief. You insulted her grandmother. She has answered every question with more dignity than most people in this room would have managed." Emily looked away fast. Not because she was embarrassed. Because kindness, when you are already hurting, can feel almost unbearable. Daniel saw that too. The smallest movement. The way her eyes dropped before tears could show. And something inside him twisted. He thought about the moment he had walked into the restaurant. His mother pointing. Emily standing there with a tray she no longer held. The guests watching as if humiliation were entertainment. He had seen plenty of people lie in his life. Board members. Lawyers. Politicians? Relatives? Liars usually rushed. They filled silence with details. They performed innocence. Emily had not performed anything. She had simply stood there, confused and wounded, protecting the memory of a woman who was no longer alive to protect herself. Daniel knew honesty when it had nothing left to hide. Margaret stepped closer to him. Do not let her manipulate you. Daniel stared at his mother. She isn't manipulating anyone. You don't know that. I know what I saw. Margaret's eyes flashed. And what exactly did you see? Daniel looked toward Emily. The whole restaurant seemed to lean closer. I saw a young woman get attacked in public, he said. I saw her boss prepare to sacrifice her because our name scares him. I saw strangers reach for their phones instead of their conscience. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Arthur lowered his head. Daniel continued. And I saw her stand there and tell the truth while everyone expected her to bow. Emily's eyes lifted to him. For a moment they just looked at each other. Two people from different worlds. One born into power. One forced to survive without it. But in that brief silence something passed between them. Not romance. Not comfort. Recognition. Daniel recognized a person being crushed by a room and refusing to disappear. Emily recognized maybe for the first time that night that someone with the Whitmore name was actually seeing her. Margaret's face hardened into stone. You are embarrassing this family. Daniel's laugh was quiet and humorless. No, mother. You did that. The word struck the room like a dropped plate. Margaret went pale. Arthur whispered, Mr. Whitmore. Daniel did not look at him. He placed the brooch gently back into Emily's open palm. The gesture was small, but everyone understood it. He was not taking his mother's side. Not blindly. Not anymore. Emily curled her fingers around it, stunned by the simple fact that he had returned it without force, without threat, without making her beg. Daniel spoke softly. Keep it safe. Emily nodded once. I will. Margaret stared at the brooch as if Daniel had handed away her daughter. You have no right, she said. Daniel turned to her, his voice low. And you had no right to decide this girl was guilty because grief made it easier. That sentence changed Margaret's face. For a second she looked older. Not powerful. Not elegant. Just 72, wounded and terrified that the story she had carried for 17 years might not be complete. But then pride returned like armor. She lifted her chin. I know what belonged to my child. Daniel softened but did not retreat. I know you loved Isabel. Margaret's eyes shone. Then help me. I am trying to. No, she whispered. You are helping her. Daniel looked at Emily again. Emily stood perfectly still, clutching the brooch to her chest. No, Daniel said. I'm helping the truth. The restaurant stayed silent. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights sliding across the front windows like a pale blade. Inside, the candle flames flickered on every table. Emily could hear herself breathing. She could hear Margaret breathing. She could hear Daniel's voice still hanging in the air. For the first time since the accusation began, Emily did not feel completely alone. And that made the room feel different. Not safer. Not yet, but different. Margaret looked from Daniel to Emily, then down at the brooch hidden inside Emily's fist. Something was breaking. Not loudly. Not all at once. But deep underneath the polished surface of the Whitmore family, a crack had opened. And Daniel Whitmore, the son who had spent his whole life standing beside his mother's storms, had finally stepped into the path of one. Emily Carter could feel the brooch pressing into her palm like a heartbeat. Small. Warm. Real. For a few seconds no one moved inside the silver lantern. The restaurant had become too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every breath sound guilty. Candles flickered on white tablecloths, half-eaten dinners sat untouched. Wineglasses caught the light but no one raised them. Margaret Whitmore stood in front of Emily with her chin high and her pride burning in her eyes. Daniel stood between them now, not fully blocking his mother but close enough to make a statement. And Emily understood exactly what was happening. The powerful woman wanted the room back. She wanted control back. She wanted Emily to feel small again. Margaret turned slightly toward Arthur Bennett. Mr. Bennett, she said, each word polished and cold, I assume you understand what kind of situation this has become. Arthur's face tightened. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Emily looked at him. She had worked for Arthur for 3 years. She knew how he smiled at guests. She knew how he praised loyalty during staff meetings. She knew how he said the Silver Lantern was a family. But now his eyes would not meet hers. Margaret continued. One of your employees is wearing a piece of jewelry connected to my deceased daughter. She has caused a public disturbance. She has refused to cooperate. And she is still standing in the middle of your dining room as if she owns it. Emily's stomach twisted. There it was. The shift. Margaret could no longer prove theft, so she changed the charge. Now Emily was not a thief. She was a problem. Arthur wiped his hands down the sides of his suit jacket. Emily, he said carefully, maybe it would be best if you took the rest of the evening off. A soft gasp moved through the staff near the kitchen. Emily stared at him. The rest of the evening off. Arthur swallowed. With pay, he added quickly as if that made humiliation generous. Just until we can sort this out. Emily's fingers curled tighter around the brooch. Behind her, one of the younger waiters lowered his eyes. Another looked toward the floor. The bartender froze with his hand on a glass. Everyone knew what take the evening off meant. Go away. Disappear. Let the rich woman feel comfortable again. Emily took one breath. Then another. Her voice came out quiet. No? Arthur blinked. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Daniel looked at her with renewed attention. Emily lifted her chin. I'm scheduled until closing, she said. I have tables. I have work. And I have done nothing wrong. Arthur's mouth opened then closed. Margaret gave a dry, humorless laugh. You truly do not understand your position. Emily turned to her. No, ma'am. I understand it very well. The answer made several guests shift in their seats. Emily's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint, but she kept her feet planted. She remembered her grandmother's voice. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of what is yours. She held onto that voice like a railing in a storm. Margaret stepped closer. You are standing in a room full of people who know exactly who I am. Emily nodded. Yes. And you still choose to challenge me. Emily looked around the restaurant. At the phones. At the silent guests. At Arthur's pale face. At the staff members watching from the edges like people trapped behind glass. Then she looked back at Margaret. I'm not challenging you, she said. I'm telling the truth. Margaret's nostrils flared. Daniel's eyes softened, but he said nothing. This was Emily's moment. And he knew it. Margaret lowered her voice until it cut even deeper. You think truth protects people like you? A chill passed through the room. Emily felt it. People like you. There it was again. Not shouted. Not named. But sharp enough to draw blood. Emily's lips trembled once. She pressed them together. No, she said. Truth doesn't always protect us. Her voice grew steadier. But lies destroy us faster. The sentence stopped the room. Even Margaret did not answer right away. Emily could feel her fear rising, but she did not run from it. She let it fill her chest, then pushed through it. I know what can happen after tonight, Emily said. I know you could make one phone call and cost me this job. I know people here might say I was rude or difficult or ungrateful. I know my name could be repeated by people who never once asked me what happened. She looked at Arthur. And I know some people will let it happen because it is easier than standing beside me. Arthur looked down. That hurt more than Emily expected. But she kept going. My grandmother gave me this brooch, she said, opening her hand, so the room could see it again. She gave it to me when she was dying. That is not a story I made up to impress anyone. That is not a trick. That is the truth. Margaret's face hardened. You cannot prove that. Emily nodded. You're right. Not tonight. Not standing here with strangers staring at me. Then she took one small step forward. But you cannot prove I stole it either. The words rang clean. Simple. Unshakable. Daniel looked at his mother. Margaret looked as if she had been slapped without being touched. Emily turned slightly toward the guests. Not dramatically. Not like a speech. Like a woman who had been forced onto a stage and finally decided to use it. I didn't ask for this, she said. I was doing my job. I was carrying food. I was trying to get through another shift. And then I was accused in front of all of you. Her voice cracked, but she recovered. No one asked me who I was. No one asked where the brooch came from. Most of you just watched. A few guests looked away. One woman slowly lowered her phone into her lap. Emily saw it. Good. Let them feel it. Margaret crossed her arms. This is becoming theatrical. Emily looked back at her. You made it public. That landed hard. Daniel almost closed his eyes. Arthur inhaled sharply. Emily's hands were shaking again, but now she did not hide them. Yes, I'm scared, she said. I'm scared because I need this job. I'm scared because rent is due. I'm scared because my grandmother is gone, and I can't call her tonight and ask her what to do. Her eyes filled. This time she let the tears stay there. But I will not take off the last thing she gave me just because a rich woman decided grief gives her permission to humiliate me. No one breathed. Margaret's face turned white. Daniel whispered, Emily. Not to stop her. Almost like a warning that she had stepped too close to fire. But Emily was already inside it. She looked directly at Margaret. I am sorry your daughter died, she said. I mean that. I would not wish that pain on anyone. But my grandmother died too. And she mattered. Maybe not to this room. Maybe not to the newspapers. Maybe not to families with buildings named after them. Her voice dropped. But she mattered to me. The room softened. Not completely. But enough. Enough for people to remember they were not watching a scandal. They were watching a young woman defend the dead. Margaret said nothing. For the first time all night she seemed unsure whether anger would save her. Emily closed her hand around the brooch again and placed it gently back near her collar. Her fingers struggled with the clasp because they were shaking so badly. Daniel stepped forward instinctively. Emily shook her head. "I've got it." 2 words. Small but full of everything. She fastened the brooch herself. The gold flowers settled against her blue uniform exactly where it had been before Margaret touched her life and tried to tear it open. Emily looked at Arthur. "I'm going to finish my shift," she said. Arthur stared at her like he did not know what language she was speaking. Then Emily turned. She walked to the service station, picked up a clean tray and straightened her apron. No one stopped her. No one knew how. Her steps were not steady at first. Her knees were weak, her throat burned. But she moved anyway. Past the tables, past the whispers, past the phones that had captured her humiliation but not her whole heart. At table 12, an older man slowly pushed back his untouched plate. "Miss," he said softly. Emily paused. He looked embarrassed. "Could I have some water, please?" It was such a normal question. So small. So human. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." Her voice was hoarse but professional. She filled the glass. Her hand still trembled slightly. The water rippled under the chandelier light. Daniel watched from the center of the dining room, his expression unreadable but changed. He had seen powerful people command rooms all his life. He had seen money bend backs, silence truth and turn cruelty into etiquette. But he had never seen anything like this. A waitress accused and humiliated simply choosing not to disappear. Margaret watched too. Her face was locked in anger but something behind her eyes had shifted. Emily Carter had not defeated her. Not yet. But she had done something Margaret had not expected. She had survived the blow. And then she had stood back up in front of everyone. Emily Carter returned to work but the restaurant did not return to normal. Nothing about the silver lantern felt normal anymore. The chandeliers still glowed. The candles still burned. The plates still sat on white linen tablecloths like nothing had happened. But the room had changed. Every sound was too sharp now. Every whisper carried. Every movement felt careful as if one wrong step might set the whole place on fire. Emily moved between tables with a water pitcher in one hand and the brooch pinned back against her collar. Exactly where it belonged. But now everyone saw it. Before tonight that little gold flower had been invisible. Just a personal detail on a waitress's uniform. A quiet memory. A private comfort. Now it was evidence. Now it was a mystery. Now it was the thing that made a billionaire tremble. Margaret Whitmore had not sat down. She stood beside her table straight-backed and furious but her eyes kept returning to Emily's collar. Again and again, like she wanted to look away and could not. Daniel noticed. So did Emily. She poured water at table 12, her hand still unsteady. A thin stream missed the glass and darkened the edge of the tablecloth. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The older man at the table gave her a gentle nod. "It's all right, dear." That one word almost broke her. Dear. Not thief. Not girl. Not problem. Dear. Emily swallowed hard and stepped back toward the service station. Her chest hurt from holding herself together. Her whole body wanted to run into the restroom, lock the door and cry until there was nothing left. But she knew if she left the room Margaret would win the story. So Emily stayed. Across the dining room, Daniel turned to Arthur Bennett. "Do you have a magnifying glass?" he asked. Arthur blinked. "A what?" "A magnifying glass. Jeweler's loupe, anything." Margaret snapped her head toward him. "Daniel, stop this." He did not look at her. "Arthur." The restaurant owner hesitated. Then he nodded too quickly. "I have one in my office. For checking wine labels. Older bottles. Sometimes the print is, get it?" Arthur disappeared toward the back. Margaret stepped closer to her son. "You are making a spectacle of this family." Daniel finally turned to her. "No, mother. The spectacle started when you grabbed a waitress by the collar in front of a full dining room." Margaret's lips tightened. "I recognized my daughter's brooch." "You recognized a brooch," Daniel said. "That's not the same thing." Her eyes flashed. "How dare you?" Daniel's voice stayed low. "I'm asking the question you should have asked before you accused her." Margaret looked toward Emily, who was standing by the service station pretending not to listen, but everyone knew she was listening. Everyone was. Daniel continued. "If that engraving is old, if it was made when the brooch was made, then this isn't simple." Margaret's face changed again. Just a flicker. The same fear from earlier. Emily saw it from across the room and her stomach tightened. Fear did not look right on Margaret Whitmore. Anger fit her. Pride fit her. Command fit her. Fear looked like something had slipped out from behind a locked door. Arthur returned with a small brass magnifying glass in his hand. He held it out to Daniel like he was handing over a live wire. Daniel took it. Then he turned toward Emily. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "may I look at the engraving again?" Emily's fingers rose to the brooch. The whole room watched. She could feel Margaret's stare like ice on her skin. Daniel added, "You don't have to hand it to me. You can hold it." That mattered? Emily nodded. Slowly, she unfastened the brooch again. The tiny click of the clasp sounded louder than it should have. She placed it in her palm just as she had before and stepped toward Daniel. Her shoes made soft taps against the polished floor. With every step she felt the eyes following her. Not just rich guests now. The staff too. The line cooks peering through the kitchen window. The bartender frozen behind the counter. The hostess standing at the front desk with one hand over her mouth. Emily stopped in front of Daniel. Margaret stood only a few feet away. Close enough to reach. Close enough to take. Emily curled her fingers slightly. Daniel saw it. "I won't touch it unless you say so," he said. Emily looked at him for a long second. Then she opened her hand. Daniel bent down, lifting the magnifying glass over the back of the brooch. He studied the clasp. The scratches. The small engraved letters. The room held its breath. R.C. 2 letters. Small, worn but clear. And beneath them, almost hidden under years of tiny scratches, there was something else. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Wait," he murmured. Margaret went still. Emily's pulse jumped. "What?" she asked. Daniel adjusted the angle toward the candlelight. "There's more." Emily leaned closer. Arthur stepped forward without realizing it. Margaret whispered, "That is enough." Daniel ignored her. He tilted the brooch again. The gold caught a thin line of light. The back of the clasp flashed. There it was. Not just R.C. Below the initials so small it nearly disappeared into the metal. Was a date. Itenjo by Tishiti. Daniel's face drained of color. Emily saw it and felt the room tilt beneath her. "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel did not answer at first. He kept staring. Margaret's hand moved to the back of a chair. For support. Emily saw that too. And suddenly, the balance in the room shifted again. Margaret was not angry now. She was afraid. Daniel looked at his mother. Isabel wasn't born until 1980. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into deep water. No one spoke. Emily blinked. Arthur's mouth opened slightly. Margaret's face turned white. Daniel straightened slowly, still holding the magnifying glass, still looking at his mother. "Mother," he said carefully, "if this engraving was already on the brooch in 1977, then it could not have been made for Isabel's 21st birthday." Margaret's eyes hardened instantly. "You don't know when that was engraved." Daniel held the brooch closer to the light again. "The engraving is worn down. The scratches go over the date, not under it." Arthur cleared his throat nervously. "That would suggest it's old," he said, then immediately looked like he regretted speaking. Margaret turned on him. "You are a restaurant owner, Mr. Bennett, not an expert." "No," Arthur said quickly. "Of course not. But the damage was done. The room had heard it. The engraving was not a detail anymore. It was a crack in Margaret's story." Emily looked down at the brooch in her hand. R.C., her grandmother's initials. A year before Isabel Whitmore was even born. Emily's breath caught. For the first time all night she felt something stronger than fear. Vindication. Not complete, not safe, but real. She looked at Margaret. "You said there was no other brooch like it." Margaret's jaw tightened. "There wasn't. You said you had it made for your daughter." "I did." Emily lifted the brooch slightly. "Then why does it have my grandmother's initials on it from before your daughter was born?" The question did not come out loud. It did not need to. It cut through the room anyway. Margaret did not answer. For once she had no sentence ready. No weapon polished. No name powerful enough to silence a date carved into gold. Daniel's voice softened. "Mother, please?" Margaret looked at him. And for one terrible second Emily saw the truth in the older woman's eyes. Not the whole truth. But enough? Margaret knew something. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the answer. But she knew the date mattered. She knew the initials mattered. She knew her version of the story was no longer standing on solid ground. Then just as quickly the wall came back up. Margaret reached for the brooch. Emily pulled her hand away. "No." Margaret's eyes snapped to hers. "This belongs to my family." Emily's voice trembled, but she did not step back. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. That's what you believe. But now we know belief isn't proof." A ripple moved through the restaurant. Daniel looked at Emily with quiet admiration. She was still scared. He could see it in the way her fingers shook around the brooch, but she was not shrinking anymore. She was not only defending a memory now, she was following the truth. Margaret's voice turned cold. "You have no idea what you're stirring up." Emily held her gaze. "Maybe you do?" The words hit harder than anyone expected. Margaret inhaled sharply. Daniel stepped closer. Emily? But Emily did not look away from Margaret. My grandmother told me this brooch was always meant to come to me, she said. I thought she meant because she loved me, but maybe she meant something else. Margaret's face flickered again. There. That fear. That recognition. That tiny moment of collapse before pride caught her. Daniel saw it clearly now. And his expression changed. Because this was no longer about a mistaken accusation. The engraving had opened a door. Behind that door was something older than Isabel's death. Older than Emily's grief. Older than the restaurant, the scandal, the phones, the whispering guests. Ursi, omiano suteshapte zechishapte. 2 initials and 1 year had done what Emily alone could not. They had forced the truth to step into the light. Margaret Whitmore stared at the brooch like it was no longer a lost piece of jewelry. It was a witness. And for the first time that night, the witness was not on her side. Margaret Whitmore heard the date before she understood the damage. Itenjo by Tishitsi. It sat in the air like a locked door swinging open. Emily Carter stood in front of her with the brooch in her palm, the tiny gold flower catching candlelight, the engraving exposed at last. Se, omiano suteshapte zechishapte. Not Isabel's name. Not Isabel's birthday. Not the year Margaret had claimed. For a moment no one inside the silver lantern breathed. Daniel Whitmore kept his eyes on his mother. He had spent his whole life reading the smallest changes in her face. The tightening of her jaw meant anger, the lifting of one eyebrow meant danger. The stillness meant she was preparing to destroy someone. But this was different. This was fear. Deep fear. Old fear? The kind that does not come from being wrong in public. The kind that comes from remembering something you buried. Emily saw it too. And suddenly, the brooch felt different in her hand. Heavier. As if her grandmother's silence had weight. Daniel spoke first. Mother, he said quietly, who was Rose Carter? Margaret looked at him too quickly. I don't know. The answer came out sharp. Too sharp. Daniel did not move. You heard Emily say her grandmother's name? Rose Carter. Initials are. C. The year 1977. That means something to you. Margaret's fingers tightened around the back of the chair beside her. It means someone engraved initials on a stolen brooch. Emily took one step forward. My grandmother was not a thief. Margaret turned on her. You keep saying that as if love proves innocence. Emily's eyes flashed. And you keep saying thief because it keeps you from asking the question. The room went still again. Daniel looked at Emily. She was trembling but no longer backing away. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes were wet. But something inside her had shifted. She was not only defending Rose now, she was demanding answers. Emily lifted the brooch slightly. How did my grandmother's initials get on this before your daughter was even born? Margaret said nothing. The silence answered too loudly. Arthur Bennett stood near the bar, frozen, with a little magnifying glass still in his hand. Around him, guests who had arrived as spectators now sat trapped in discomfort. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody laughed. Even the phones were slowly lowering, as if people understood they were no longer recording gossip. They were watching a family secret crawl out into the light. Daniel turned to Arthur. Do you have a private office? Arthur nodded. Yes. Of course. Margaret immediately straightened. No. Daniel looked back at her. We need to talk. There is nothing to discuss. Then say it here. Margaret's face hardened. Daniel's voice dropped. Say in front of everyone that Rose Carter meant nothing to this family? Margaret's lips parted. No words came. Emily felt her pulse beat in her throat. Daniel saw the hesitation. He saw it clearly now, and the realization hit him with a strange, sick force. His mother knew the name. She had known it from the moment Emily said it. Maybe not as Rose Carter. Maybe another version of it. Another life. Another room. But she knew. Daniel stepped closer to her. Mother. Margaret looked away. And that was the first true confession. Not spoken. But seen. Emily clutched the brooch so tightly the edges pressed into her skin. My grandmother never talked about rich people, she said softly. She never talked about this family. She barely talked about anything before I was born. Her voice thinned. When I asked about old pictures, she would say some memories are not meant for children. When I asked why she kept that purple box hidden on top of her dresser, she would smile and say, one day you'll understand. Emily looked down at the brooch. I thought she was just being sentimental. Daniel's eyes stayed on Margaret. What happened in 1977? Margaret closed her eyes. Just for 1 second. But in that second, the mask slipped. The billionaire widow disappeared. A mother disappeared. What remained was a woman standing too close to a past she had spent decades refusing to touch. Then she opened her eyes again. I was young, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel froze. Emily stopped breathing. Margaret stared at the brooch, not at either of them. We all were. No one interrupted. Even the restaurant seemed to understand that one careless sound might make her stop forever. Margaret swallowed. There was a woman, she said. She worked for the family. Not as a servant exactly. She helped in the house when my father was ill. She was quiet, kind, too kind for that place. Emily's fingers went cold. What was her name? Margaret did not answer at first. Then softly, like the name hurt her mouth, she said, Rose? Emily's knees weakened. Daniel reached out slightly, but Emily steadied herself before he could touch her. Rose? Not a guess. Not a coincidence. Her grandmother had been in the Whitmore family's life. Margaret continued, each word pulled out of her like glass. She was close to someone in the family. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Who? Margaret's face tightened. My brother. The room shifted. A woman near the window covered her mouth. Arthur looked down at the floor. Daniel stared at his mother as if the walls of his childhood home were rearranging themselves inside his mind. Uncle Charles, he asked. Margaret's silence confirmed it. Emily felt the brooch burn in her palm. Her grandmother. Rose Carter. A man named Charles Whitmore. The pieces did not form a full picture yet, but the edges were appearing. Margaret's voice became colder but not stronger. It was the cold of someone trying not to fall apart. My father would never have allowed it. A Whitmore son and a girl like Rose. She looked briefly at Emily, then away. It was impossible. Emily's face tightened. A girl like Rose. Margaret flinched. Daniel spoke before Emily could. You mean poor? Margaret did not answer. Emily's voice was low. You mean not good enough? Margaret looked at her then. Really looked. For the first time, the arrogance in her eyes cracked under something like shame. She was good, Margaret whispered. That was the problem. Emily did not understand. Daniel did? His mother had grown up in a house where love was permitted only if it protected the family name. If it threatened it, love became a scandal. A mistake. A problem to be solved quietly. Margaret went on. Charles gave her a brooch. Not this one exactly, she stopped, then corrected herself. Or perhaps this one. I never knew where he got it. I remember seeing it once in his hand. A gold flower with a green stone. He said it was for spring. Emily's breath caught. Spring after a hard winter. The words Margaret had used for Isabel. Maybe they had not begun with Isabel at all. Maybe that phrase was older. Maybe Margaret had taken one memory and placed it over another because grief made it easier than truth. Daniel's voice was tight. And Rose kept it. Margaret nodded faintly. She left the house not long after. Why? Margaret's lips trembled. Because my father found out. Emily felt a chill move through her. What did he do? Margaret looked at the floor. He made it clear she had no future there. Emily's eyes burned. My grandmother spent her whole life working. She raised me with nothing. And all this time she had something connected to your family hidden in a velvet box. Margaret did not defend herself. That frightened Daniel more than any denial would have. Emily looked at the brooch again. The initials were no longer only initials. They were a trail. Rose Carter had not stolen a wealthy woman's jewel. She had carried a piece of love out of a house that had rejected her. Daniel's voice broke the silence. Mother, why did you say it belonged to Isabel? Margaret looked at him and her eyes filled for the first time that night. Because Isabel loved it, she said. Years later I saw it again. I don't know how Charles got it back. I don't know what happened. But I remember Isabel wearing it, smiling in the mirror. I remember fastening it. She turned toward Emily. And when I saw it on you, all I saw was my daughter. Emily held her gaze. But it was my grandmother's first. Margaret's face collapsed slightly. Yes. One word. Small. Devastating. The restaurant stayed silent. Emily looked down at the brooch and suddenly Rose was there with her. Not as a fragile old woman in a bed but young. Standing in a wealthy house. Holding a forbidden gift. Loving someone she was told she could not love. Emily's hand shook. Daniel stepped beside her, not in front of her. Emily, he said gently, this means your grandmother was part of our family's story long before tonight. Emily nodded, but her eyes did not leave Margaret. No, she said softly. It means my grandmother had a story your family tried to erase. Margaret had no answer. Because the brooch had done what no one else in that room could do. It had connected two dead women. Rose Carter and Isabel Whitmore. A grandmother who carried silence. A daughter who carried grief. And between them one small gold flower that had survived money, shame, loss and time. Emily closed her hand around it. For the first time she understood why Rose had said it was always meant to come to her. Not because it was pretty. Not because it was valuable. Because it was proof. Proof that Rose had loved. Proof that Rose had suffered. Proof that Rose had existed inside a history powerful people wanted hidden. And now in the middle of the silver lantern with every eye on her, Emily Carter finally knew one thing for certain. Her grandmother had not left her a stolen brooch. She had left her the key to the truth. The name Charles Whitmore sat between them like a match held too close to dry paper. Emily Carter heard it once. Then again in her mind, Charles Whitmore. Her grandmother, Rose Carter, had loved a Whitmore. That alone was enough to make the room tilt. But the way Margaret's face tightened told Emily there was more. Much more. Daniel saw it too. His mother had admitted only what she could no longer deny. She had given them the smallest piece of the truth and hoped it would be enough to stop the bleeding. It wasn't. Daniel stepped closer. What happened after Rose left the house, he asked. Margaret's eyes moved toward the front windows where the city lights blurred against the glass. For a moment she looked like she wanted to walk out into the night and leave the past behind her. But the past had already found the door. Emily stood still, the brooch pressed against her palm. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice quiet but firm, my grandmother spent her whole life hiding this. I need to know why. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them, the anger was gone. What remained was worse. Regret. Rose was pregnant, Margaret whispered. The words hit Emily so hard she almost stopped breathing. Daniel turned his head slowly. What? Margaret's lips trembled. She was pregnant when she left. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. Arthur Bennett looked away as if even witnessing this felt like trespassing. Emily's fingers tightened around the brooch until the edge dug into her skin. No, she whispered. But she did not know what she was refusing. The truth. The pain. The possibility. Margaret looked at her now, and for the first time there was no insult in her eyes. No superiority. Only a terrible old sadness. My father found out about Charles and Rose, she said. He was furious. He said she had trapped him. He said she wanted money, status, the family name. Emily's face hardened. My grandmother would never. I know, Margaret said. That stopped her. Margaret swallowed. I know that now. Daniel's voice was low. What did grandfather do? Margaret looked at him. He sent her away. The words were simple. Too simple for what they carried. He gave her money, Daniel asked. Margaret shook her head. No, he gave her a warning. Emily felt the blood leave her face. Margaret continued, every word slower than the last. He told Rose that if she came near Charles again he would destroy her. He would make sure no respectable home hired her. No doctor helped her. No church took her in. He told her the child would never carry the Whitmore name. Emily looked down at the brooch. Rose had carried that alone. Young. Pregnant. Cast out by people who had enough money to erase her. Daniel turned away, jaw tight. For the first time he looked ashamed not only of his mother but of the entire house he came from. What did Charles do? He asked. Margaret's eyes filled. He didn't know. Daniel stared at her. What do you mean he didn't know? My father told him Rose had left willingly. That she had taken money, that she wanted nothing to do with him. Emily's breath shook. That was a lie. Yes. The word was barely audible. Daniel's hands curled into fists. And you knew? Margaret did not answer. That was answer enough. Emily looked at her, stunned. You knew she was pregnant? Margaret's tears finally slipped free. I was young, she said. Emily's voice cut through her. You were old enough. Margaret flinched. The room went silent. Not one guest moved. Emily took a step toward her. My grandmother raised a child alone because your family was ashamed of her. Margaret covered her mouth with one trembling hand. She had a daughter, Margaret whispered. Rose had a little girl. Emily's heart began to pound. Daniel looked at Emily. Emily looked back at him. The whole restaurant seemed to disappear. A daughter. Rose's daughter. Emily's mother. The missing bridge between two families. Margaret forced herself to continue. Years later I saw Rose again. Only once. She was standing outside a hospital. She had a little girl with her. Maybe 5 years old. Dark curls. Serious eyes. She was holding Rose's hand with both of hers. Emily's knees weakened. Her mother. She had almost no memories of her mother. Only fragments. A soft song. A yellow dress. The smell of soap. Then illness. Then absence. What was her name? Daniel asked. Margaret looked at Emily. I only heard Rose say it once. Emily could barely breathe. What was it? Margaret's voice broke. Mary. Emily closed her eyes. Mary Carter. Her mother. The woman who died when Emily was too young to understand that some losses never stop echoing. Margaret went on. Charles was with me that day. He saw them before I did. He froze in the street like someone had shot him. Daniel whispered. He knew. Margaret nodded. He knew the second he saw that child. Emily opened her eyes. What happened? Margaret wiped her tears, but more came. Rose saw him too. She turned away. Charles tried to follow her, but my father's driver was there. My father had people everywhere. Always watching. Always managing the family's mistakes. Daniel's voice hardened. Mistakes? Margaret looked at him. That is what he called them. Emily stepped back, shaking her head. My mother was not a mistake. No, Margaret said quickly. She was not. But the words came too late to soften the wound. Emily looked around the restaurant. At the wealthy guests. The polished floors. The crystal glasses. The world Margaret belonged to. A world that had looked at Rose Carter and decided she was disposable. A world that had looked at Emily Carter tonight and almost made the same decision again. Daniel spoke carefully. Did Charles ever find Rose after that? Margaret shook her head. He tried. My father stopped him every time. Letters disappeared. Phone calls were blocked. Addresses changed before he could reach them. And then Charles got sick. Emily's anger paused. Sick? Margaret nodded. He never married. He never forgave himself, even though he did not know the full truth until much later. By the time he learned what my father had done, Rose was gone from the city. Daniel's face darkened. And the brooch. Margaret looked at it in Emily's hand. Charles gave it to Rose in 1977. He had her initials engraved on it. R.C. He said it was proof that someone in our family had loved her honestly. Emily's eyes filled. The brooch blurred in her palm. Proof. That was the word again. Margaret's voice grew softer. Years after that, somehow the brooch came back to Charles. I don't know if Rose returned it or if someone took it from her or if my father interfered again. Charles kept it hidden. After he died, Isabel found it among his things. Daniel inhaled sharply. Isabel didn't know. No, Margaret said. She thought it was beautiful. She wore it. I let her. Emily stared at her. You knew it had belonged to my grandmother. Margaret could not meet her eyes. Yes. The answer dropped into the room like a stone. Emily's voice was almost a whisper. And tonight when you saw it on me, you called me a thief. Margaret broke. Her shoulders lowered. Her face crumpled. For the first time all night she looked not like a billionaire, not like a queen of society, but like an old woman standing in the ruins of what her pride had protected. I saw Isabel, she said. I saw my daughter and I panicked. Emily's tears finally fell. No, she said. You saw my grandmother's truth and tried to bury it again. Margaret had no defense. Daniel looked at Emily with pain in his eyes. Because now he understood. Emily was not a stranger wearing a stolen jewel. She was connected to them by blood, by silence, by a love their family had destroyed and then hidden for decades. The brooch had not wandered into Emily's life. It had returned. Through Rose, through Mary, to Emily. And in the middle of the silver lantern, surrounded by people who had once watched her humiliation like dinner, entertainment, Emily Carter stood holding the proof that her grandmother had never been a thief. She had been erased. And tonight, her granddaughter had brought her back. Margaret Whitmore had spent her entire life standing tall. Tall in boardrooms. Tall at charity galas. Tall at funerals. Tall even when her daughter's casket disappeared beneath white flowers and the whole city whispered about her strength. But now in the center of the silver lantern she looked smaller than anyone had ever seen her. The restaurant stayed silent around her. Not polite silence. Not respectful silence. This was heavier. This was the kind of silence that comes after a truth has been spoken and no one knows where to put their hands. Emily Carter stood a few feet away, the brooch resting in her palm. Her grandmother's brooch. Rose Carter's brooch. The proof of a love that had been hidden, stolen, returned, twisted, and nearly buried again under Margaret's accusation. Daniel Whitmore did not speak. He watched his mother. And for the first time in his life he did not see the woman everyone feared. He saw the woman fear had made. Margaret's lips trembled. Her fingers gripped the back of the chair so hard her knuckles had gone pale. The diamonds on her wrist glittered under the chandelier, but they looked useless now, cold little stones on a woman who could not buy her way out of the past. Emily's voice came softly. You knew? Margaret closed her eyes. Emily took one step closer. You knew my grandmother's name. You knew the brooch was hers. You knew there was more to this story. Margaret's chin lifted by instinct. That old movement. That old armor. But it failed halfway. Her shoulders dropped. Yes, she whispered. The single word traveled through the room like a confession in church. A woman at table 6 put her hand over her mouth. One of the waiters near the kitchen bowed his head. Arthur Bennett stood frozen, his shame now visible on his face. Emily did not look away. Then why, she asked. Margaret opened her eyes. They were wet now. Not with the clean tears people show in public when they want sympathy. These were ugly tears, humiliating tears. Tears that came from a place too old to control. Because I couldn't bear it, Margaret said. Emily's face tightened. Bear what? Margaret looked at the brooch. Then at Emily. Then finally at Daniel. I couldn't bear knowing that my family had destroyed Rose, she said. I couldn't bear knowing my father had sent her away pregnant. I couldn't bear knowing Charles spent the rest of his life looking for a woman we had helped erase. Daniel's jaw clenched. We. Margaret flinched. He stepped forward. You keep saying my grandfather. But you knew? You were there. Margaret turned to him wounded. I was young. Daniel's voice broke, but not with weakness. With money? With safety. With a name that protected you. Margaret stared at him. Daniel's eyes were shining now. Rose had none of that. The words hit her harder than anger would have. Margaret looked down. For once she had no defense ready. Emily's fingers tightened around the brooch, but her voice stayed quiet. My grandmother lived her whole life with that pain. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. No, Emily said. You don't. Margaret looked up. Emily's tears were falling now, but she did not wipe them away. You don't know what it means to stretch soup for 3 days. You don't know what it means to hold a sick woman's hand and wish you could give her the life she deserved. You don't know what it means to ask about your own family and watch someone you love go silent because the memory still hurts. Margaret's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Emily continued, and now her voice shook with all the years Rose had never spoken. You saw my grandmother once. Maybe twice. You remembered her as a problem your family handled. I knew her as the woman who raised me. The woman who laughed when the power went out. The woman who sang while folding towels. The woman who saved coins in a coffee can so I could have new shoes for school. The room seemed to soften around her. Even Margaret softened. Not enough to heal, but enough to hear. Emily lifted the brooch. She gave me this because she wanted me to know the truth someday. And tonight, when that truth finally showed up, you tried to call it theft. Margaret covered her face with one hand. A quiet sound escaped her. Not a sob yet. Something before a sob. A collapse beginning deep inside. Daniel watched her torn between pity and pain. He had seen his mother grieve Isabel. He had seen her sit alone in Isabel's bedroom for hours. He had seen her hold a photograph so tightly the frame cracked. He had spent years believing her cruelty came from loss. But now he understood something worse. Her grief had not made her cruel. It had only removed the last reason she had to hide it. Margaret lowered her hand. I loved Isabel, she said almost desperately. You have to understand that. When I saw the brooch on you, I saw my daughter. I saw the day she wore it. I saw her standing in front of the mirror. I heard her laugh. Emily's expression did not change. Margaret's voice broke. And then I saw her dead again. Daniel closed his eyes. Emily's anger faltered for half a second. Because grief was still grief. Even when it had done harm. Margaret continued, trembling now. I have lived 17 years with one question. Why did she have to die? Why my child? Why that day? Why that road? And when that brooch disappeared, I held onto it like one more cruelty the world had done to me. She looked at Emily. But it was never only mine to grieve. That sentence seemed to cost her everything. The restaurant waited. Margaret took a breath, but it shattered halfway. I turned Isabel into an excuse, she said. For anger. For suspicion. For the way I treated people. For the way I treated you tonight. Emily did not rescue her from the silence. No one did. Margaret had to stand inside it. She turned slowly, looking at the faces around the room. The guests who had watched. The staff who had stayed silent. Arthur pale with guilt. Daniel devastated. Emily wounded but unbroken. The weight of it came down at once. All her years of command. All her pride. All her certainty. And beneath it, the truth: she had not protected her daughter's memory tonight. She had attacked another woman's granddaughter. Margaret's knees seemed to weaken. Daniel moved instinctively, but she raised a hand to stop him. No, she whispered. She would not be held up. Not yet. She looked at Emily again. When I grabbed your collar, Margaret said, her voice barely steady, I did not see you. Emily's eyes narrowed, not cruelly but carefully. Margaret forced herself to continue. I saw a story I wanted to be true because it was easier than the real one. If you were a thief, then Rose could remain a shadow. Charles could remain tragic. My father could remain complicated instead of cruel. And I, she swallowed, I could remain innocent. Daniel looked away. That was the first honest thing Margaret had said about herself all night. Emily breathed in slowly. And are you? Margaret looked at her. The question hung between them. Are you innocent? Margaret's face crumpled. No. The word was not loud. But it was complete. No, she said again. I am not. For the first time, she did not sound like Margaret Whitmore, billionaire widow. She sounded like an old woman finally telling the truth before it killed her. I was afraid of my father, she said. I was afraid of losing my place in the family. I was afraid of being cast out the way Rose was. So I said nothing. And then I built a life where no one could ever make me feel powerless again. She looked around the room. But power did not make me brave. Emily stood very still. The words reached her, but they did not erase anything. They could not. Margaret looked at the brooch in Emily's palm. That belonged to Rose, she said. Emily's breath caught. Margaret's voice trembled. It belonged to your grandmother before it ever belonged to my daughter. Daniel exhaled like he had been holding his breath for years. Emily looked down at the gold flower. The room blurred. Rose had been believed. At last, Margaret lowered her head. The proud woman who had entered the restaurant like a storm now stood broken beneath the chandelier light, stripped of certainty, stripped of command, facing the young waitress she had tried to destroy. I was wrong, she whispered. Emily said nothing. Margaret looked up, tears streaking her face. And I have been wrong for a very long time. Margaret Whitmore stood under the chandelier light with tears on her face. No one had ever seen her like that. Not the guests in the silver lantern. Not the staff. Not even Daniel. For most of his life, Daniel had watched his mother survive every room by becoming harder than the room itself. If someone challenged her, she froze them out. If someone embarrassed her, she erased them. If someone reminded her of pain, she turned that pain into a blade and handed the wound to somebody else. But now there was no blade left. Only the brooch. Only Emily Carter. Only the truth. Emily did not move. Her hand was still closed around the small gold flower. Her eyes were red, her breathing uneven, but her back was straight. She had walked into work that evening as a waitress trying to finish a shift. Now she stood as the granddaughter of Rose Carter. The woman a powerful family had tried to forget. Margaret looked at her. Really looked at her. Not at the uniform. Not at the job. Not at the class difference. Not at the young woman she had accused. At Emily. A person. A granddaughter. A living witness. Margaret swallowed. The sound was small, but in the quiet restaurant it carried. Miss Carter, she said. Emily's jaw tightened. That name spoken with respect sounded strange after everything Margaret had said. Margaret seemed to feel it too. She took one step forward, then stopped. She did not want Emily to think she was reaching for the brooch again. She did not want to take anything else from her. Not tonight. Not ever. So she kept her hands at her sides. I owe you something, Margaret said. Emily's voice came carefully. You owe my grandmother something. Margaret closed her eyes. The words hurt. They were supposed to. Yes, she whispered. I do. A long pause. Then Margaret turned. Not toward Daniel. Not toward Arthur. Toward the room. The same room where she had raised her voice. The same room where she had pointed a finger at Emily and called her a thief. The same room that had watched a young woman's dignity get dragged across the floor like a dropped napkin. Margaret lifted her chin. But this time it was not pride. It was effort. I want everyone here to hear me, she said. The restaurant froze even deeper. A man near the window lowered his phone completely. A woman in pearls sat back slowly, her hand still on her chest. The bartender stopped wiping the same glass. In the kitchen doorway, two line cooks stood shoulder to shoulder listening. Arthur Bennett looked like he wanted to disappear. Margaret's voice trembled, but she did not stop. Earlier tonight, I accused this young woman of stealing from my family. Emily stared at the floor for 1 second. Daniel watched his mother closely. Margaret continued. I did it loudly. I did it publicly. I did it without proof. The words settled over the dining room. Without proof. That phrase mattered. Emily looked up. Margaret's eyes found hers again. I grabbed her uniform. I humiliated her in front of strangers. I threatened to call the police. I allowed my grief, my pride, and my family name to become weapons. No one moved. Not one fork. Not one glass. Margaret took a breath and it broke in the middle. And I was wrong. Emily's fingers loosened slightly around the brooch. The words were not enough. But they were real. Margaret turned fully toward her now. Miss Carter, she said, I am sorry. The room seemed to exhale, but Emily did not. Margaret stepped no closer. She understood finally that apologies should not demand comfort from the wounded. I am sorry for calling you a thief. I am sorry for speaking about your grandmother as if she were beneath mine. I am sorry for assuming that my pain mattered more than yours. Emily's face trembled. Margaret's voice dropped. And I am sorry that Rose Carter was treated as if her life could be erased. That was the line that broke something. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But Emily felt it. A crack in the wall she had been holding up all night. Her grandmother's name had been spoken in public. With respect. By the woman who had tried to bury it. Emily closed her eyes for half a second. She could almost feel Rose's hand again. Thin fingers, warm palm. The little purple velvet box between them. This was yours now. Always was. When Emily opened her eyes, Margaret was still standing there. Waiting. Not demanding forgiveness. Not reaching for pity, just standing inside the damage she had caused. Daniel looked at Emily. He did not speak for her. He did not rescue the moment. He only stood nearby, quiet and steady, giving her space to answer or not answer at all. Emily finally said, "You embarrassed me." Margaret nodded. "Yes. In front of everyone. Yes. You made them look at me like I was dirty." Margaret's face crumpled. "I know." Emily's voice shook harder now. "You made my grandmother sound like a criminal?" Margaret bowed her head. "Yes." Emily swallowed and a tear slipped down her cheek. "She was the best person I ever knew." Margaret whispered, "I believe you." Emily looked at her sharply. That answer mattered. Because it was not argument. It was not defense. It was belief. Margaret lifted her head. "I should have believed you the first time you said it." The room stayed silent. Emily wiped one tear with the back of her hand, then seemed almost angry that it had fallen. She straightened again. "I don't know if I can forgive you tonight." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand." "No," Emily said. "I need you to really understand." Margaret stilled. Emily held up the brooch. "This is not just a piece of jewelry. It was the only thing my grandmother gave me that made me feel connected to something bigger than loss. And when you saw it, you tried to take that from me." Margaret's eyes filled again. Emily continued. "You don't get to fix that with one apology." Margaret accepted the words without flinching. "You are right." Daniel looked down, his throat tight. Emily lowered the brooch. "But you said her name." Margaret nodded. "Rose Carter." Emily breathed in shakily. "And you admitted it belonged to her." "Yes," Margaret said. "It belonged to Rose Carter first." The room heard it. The phones heard it. Arthur heard it. The staff heard it. And for the first time in decades, Rose Carter was no longer hidden in whispers, locked rooms, and old guilt. She was part of the record. Emily turned toward Arthur Bennett. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was clear. "And you?" Arthur's face went pale. "Emily." She waited. The whole restaurant turned toward him. Arthur looked at Margaret, then at Daniel, then at the staff gathered near the kitchen. Finally, he looked at Emily. "I failed you," he said. Emily said nothing. Arthur took a step forward, shame heavy in his voice. "You were my employee. You were in my restaurant. And instead of protecting you from a public accusation, I tried to move you out of sight." Margaret lowered her eyes. Arthur continued. "That was cowardly. I'm sorry." Emily nodded once. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. That was all she had to give. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried. "Tomorrow I'll have our family attorney review everything connected to Rose Carter, Charles Whitmore, and the brooch. Not to take it from Emily. To document the truth." Margaret looked at him. For once she did not object. Daniel turned to Emily. "Only with your permission." Emily studied him. A man from the family that had destroyed Rose. A man who had also returned the brooch to her hand when it mattered. She nodded slowly. "We document the truth," she said. "But the brooch stays with me?" Daniel answered at once. "Of course." Margaret looked at the brooch and something like grief passed over her face again. But this time she did not reach for it. She only said, "It is where it belongs." Emily's lips pressed together. The words landed deep. For a moment nobody spoke. Then from somewhere near the back, an older woman at a small table began to clap. One slow clap. Then another. Her husband joined her. Then a waiter. Then the bartender. Then one by one the sounds spread through the silver lantern. Not wild applause. Not celebration. Something quieter. A room trying clumsily and too late to honor a young woman who had stood alone and refused to be crushed. Emily looked overwhelmed. She almost stepped back. Daniel's eyes softened. Margaret did not clap. She knew she had no right to join the praise. Instead, she lowered her head. A public apology had been given. A family name had been forced to kneel. And Emily Carter, still wearing her blue uniform, still holding her grandmother's brooch, stood in the center of the dining room, no longer as the accused waitress, but as the woman who made the truth impossible to ignore. The applause slowly faded, but something warmer stayed behind. Emily Carter looked down at the brooch on her uniform. For the first time that night, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. Margaret Whitmore stood a few steps away, no longer towering over anyone. Her pride had fallen. Her voice was softer now. "Rose deserved better," Margaret whispered. Emily nodded, tears shining in her eyes. She did. Daniel stepped beside them, holding the old truth like something fragile. In that moment, the silver lantern was no longer a room divided by money, power, and fear. It became the place where a forgotten woman was finally remembered. Rose Carter had been erased by a powerful family. but her granddaughter had brought her back. Not with anger. Not with revenge. With courage. With truth. With a small gold brooch that had survived decades of silence. Emily touched it gently and looked at Margaret. "I can't change what happened," she said. "But I can make sure her name is never hidden again." Margaret lowered her head. And this time it was not defeat. It was respect. That night Emily walked out of the restaurant with her job, her dignity, and her grandmother's story restored. The people who had watched her humiliation now watched her leave in silence. Because they understood. The waitress they had underestimated had done the impossible. She had made the truth stand taller than power. Never judge someone by their uniform, their job, or the place they stand in society. Behind every quiet person may be a history of pain, sacrifice, and strength. Money can control rooms, but it cannot erase the truth forever. If this story touched your heart, comment below. Truth always finds its way. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what courage really looks like.